Today I'm going to be talking about the Pennsylvanian coal swamps. These swamps were formed in the Carboniferous period, which was mainly comprised of two different periods of time: the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian. The Mississippian ranged from about 559.2 million years ago, and it spanned to about 318.1 million years ago. And the Pennsylvanian followed immediately after and spanned from 318.1 million years ago to 299 million years ago. The main difference between these two periods of time is the Mississippian was obviously the early Carboniferous, and so it was more of a marine type environment. The glaciers that were on the South Pole, they were not, they didn't intrude as far north onto the landmass, which led to a higher sea level. When you shift into the Pennsylvanian, the glaciers extend out, which obviously lowers the sea level, which exposed more land, so there's more terrestrial environment than there was in the previous Mississippian, which allowed for plants and these swamps and forests to develop. As you can see here, this is the how the Earth looked during the early Carboniferous. So this would be the Mississippian, and as stated before, it's mostly a marine environment, a lot of shallow sea, and just overall marine environment. This is due to the glaciation, as you can see on the bottom of this photo. The light blue shaded area is the glaciation, and these glaciers are not intruding very far onto the landmass. Therefore, the sea level is particularly high. This is the world in the late Carboniferous, or the Pennsylvanian, and as you can see, the glacier has intruded onto a lot of the landmass, which has lowered the sea level, which in turn has exposed more land. Compared to the Mississippian, there's a vast amount more of terrestrial land, which led to the thriving of plants and of these shallow water terrestrial environments that eventually came to form the Pennsylvanian coal beds. So along with all these changes that were happening due to the glaciers obviously intruding out onto the land, there's a lot of tectonic activity going on as well. Laurasia, which is the landmass in the northern hemisphere, was moving southward towards the equator, while Gondwana, which was the landmass that had all the ice on it, for all the glaciers on it, it was the landmass in the south, or the southern hemisphere. It was moving north towards the equator, and essentially they were set on a collision path, and they actually did end up colliding, which caused even more terrestrial landscape, including different mountains and things of that sort. As you can see here, this is in the late Carboniferous, or in the Pennsylvanian, and these two land masses have collided, and this picture kind of shows the climate that occurred in different parts of this landmass. And we're looking at the green dots, or the green circles. This is where coal deposits were formed. As you can see, for the most part, not all, but most of these dots are located between these two lines that depict a tropical kind of environment. And this was due to, obviously, it was a warm, humid environment that helped some of these plants to thrive. These swamps formed primarily from a broad climate shift. This climate shift was brought along by two things. Obviously, these two land masses combining and forming one larger land mass is going to change weather patterns, as well as the glaciers that were intruding and receding in kind of a cyclic manner. again, the environment moved from more of a marine into a terrestrial, which allowed for plants and particularly ferns, which became very abundant in these swamps, to thrive. These were all contributing factors to how and why these coal swamps were formed and how they formed. So as you can see here, these are some depictions on what we believe the coal swamps would have looked like. As you can see, the water is usually present. That's because how the actual coal formed was water helped preserve these carbon organisms, or basically the plants and leaves, and it turned them into a thing called peat. And basically this peat did not decay because it was under the water, and it was somewhat preserved. Then as soon as it was deposited over with sediment, it was buried, and then eventually through time it was subjected to extreme heat and extreme pressure, and these coal beds were formed. So this shallow water marine environment was vital to the formation of these the coal in these coal swamps. The world was going through different climate and atmospheric changes during the Carboniferous. Primarily during the Mississippian, the temperature was really pretty stable, and was actually going through a cooling trend into the Pennsylvanian. And the CO2 concentration was relatively, or on a steady decline during both of these periods. Like I said, the world was going through both climate and atmospheric changes during the Carboniferous. This blue line here is the average global temperature, with the black being the atmospheric concentration of CO2. The CO2 is measured in parts per million, and you can see that depiction on the left-hand side, while the average global temperature is in degrees Celsius and it is on the right-hand side. As the Carboniferous, it's about right smack dab in the middle, and as you can see, for about the first half, the temperature is really pretty steady. That was during most of the Mississippian, and right about halfway you can see where it declines. This is known as the Pennsylvanian Ice Age, and this was very paramount to basically a lot of these organisms or these plant swamps to be able to thrive. This brought on a more humid kind of environment instead of an arid desert type environment. And as you can see, the atmospheric CO2 concentration was pretty much declining throughout most of the Mississippian, and then kind of flatlined, and it stayed pretty much the same, maybe a slight rise through the Pennsylvanian. Ironically, what led to the demise of these coal or swamp beds that were formed during the Pennsylvanian is kind of what helped develop them in the first place. The tectonic activity obviously continued to happen, and the supercontinent of Pangaea was eventually formed. Once this landmass known as Pangaea was formed, it again continued to change weather patterns, and everything turned into more of a dry, arid climate. So a lot of these plants that required water or very humid environments weren't able to survive, and thus stopped the formation of these coal swamps, and was the end of the Pennsylvanian coal beds. Just to reiterate, this is the world during the early Triassic, and as you can see, Laurasia has collided with Gondwana to form Pangaea. The formation, like I said, of this supercontinent led to the changing of the temperatures and climates again, and made everything more of an arid desert climate, which is obviously not conducive to the warm, humid, shallow marine environment that the swamps were in previously. So that is my presentation on the Pennsylvanian coal swamps or coal beds. One thing I found particularly interesting about this subject was basically the thing that allowed them to form and allowed them, allowed the plants to flourish, which was the change in climate and environment, basically led to their demise. Obviously, the tectonic activity uh, kept going and never stopped, formed Pangea, and thus created desert lands where basically these swamps used to be. So that was one thing I found really interesting about this subject.